Welcome back to another module of COM 3073. In the next two videos, for modules 5 and 6, we're going to talk about how to create or locate a measure of all variables in your quantitative study. In today's video, we cover the all-important explication process, in which we define concepts and then find suitable measures that are consistent with our definitions. All of the information will help you to select an appropriate measure if you're embarking on a quantitative research project. So let's get into the content of Module 5. Before we begin, I think a roadmap will be helpful for previewing what we're going to be talking about in today's video. First, we're going to cover the process of conceptualizing and operationalizing each variable in a hypothesis. Second, we're going to talk about the proper use of vocabulary in measurement, focusing on the use of the terms questionnaires, measures, and scales. Then we're going to turn our attention to common types of scaling, giving precedence in our discussion to the most widely used scaling methods, the Likert type and semantic differential scales. Finally, I'm going to preview what we can expect in Part 2 of measurement in Module 6. Let's start with an important and fundamental idea when discussing measurement. We have lots of variables of interest to us in the communication field. We might be interested in studying credibility, communication apprehension, love, political affiliation, religiosity, media consumption, and the list goes on. For every variable we're interested in, however, we have to make careful considerations of how we're going to measure a given variable. How many items do we need? What kinds of scalings should we use? Should we include definitions? Are all questions a researcher may ask him or herself when putting together a questionnaire. But it all begins with conceptualization. When I say conceptualization, I essentially mean how I define something. And you already know that there are two ways to define a term. The dictionary definition, which is called the denotative definition, and the way you define it through norms and conventions, called the connotative definitions. We begin the measurement process by bringing a lot of clarity to the definition of a variable because we need to know how that variable is defined. It's also a way for us to ensure that we're on the same page with other scholars who are also researching that variable. After we have solid definitions in the conceptualization stage, we then move on to the operationalization phase. In it, we say how we're going to take the defined concept and apply a measure to it that fits its definition. The process of matching conceptual definitions with operational definitions, or the measurement for that variable, is called explication. So let me give you a quick example of this explication process. Suppose that after a literature search on a study I'm doing addressing psychosocial problems and attraction, I come up with the hypothesis that social anxiety is negatively associated with social attractiveness. You probably can already guess that the two variables of interest here are social anxiety and social attraction. And because I propose a negative hypothesis, I'm guessing that as the perception of another person's social anxiety goes up, their social attractiveness goes down, and vice versa. Here we are at the hypothesis stage. Now that I'm firm in the hypothesis that I'm testing, I need to move on to the conceptualization stage. For social anxiety, I relied on the work of Leary and Claus and Associates to define what social anxiety and social attractiveness are. Social anxiety is the fear of negative evaluations from others, whereas social attractiveness is the degree of desire to be friends with another person based on their personality. Once I'm clear on what these variables are, I need to find or create a measure that matches these definitions. In the operationalization stage, I found that Watson and Friends' fear of negative evaluation scale matches the definition of social anxiety very closely. And the interpersonal attractiveness measure by Burney and Griffith also does a good job of measuring the degree of desire to be friends. That's the basis for hypothesizing, conceptualization, and operationalization. What I just said about the explication process assumes that we have both the definition and the measurement of the concept in which we're interested. What if the concept we want to conduct quantitative research on, however, is so new that we don't have enough information about its conceptualization or operationalization? This is actually a problem I faced in the early 2010s. I started to see growing accounts both anecdotally, in memes, and in news media about the growing incidence of interpersonal surveillance online. Labeled things like online lurking and Facebook stalking, I wanted to know more about this phenomenon, but unfortunately there wasn't enough information to help me in this explication process. So what did I do to make up for this deficit in information? Well, I rolled up my sleeves and dove deep into the existing literature on the topic and personal accounts of people who said they surveyed others online. After reading through what little was published on the topic and participants' personal narratives, I conceptualized interpersonal online surveillance as surreptitious strategies individuals use over communication technologies to gain awareness of other users' offline and/or online behaviors. Next, after going through all of the information, I constructed a 14-item measure on online interpersonal surveillance to operationalize it, which I made available for others to use in the 2016 article I published on the topic. Here's yet another example of the explication process in practice. I wanted to take some time to talk about labeling because a lot of people have different images that come to mind when they hear the words scales, measures, questionnaires, and surveys. In research methods, survey is a method used to collect data from people. We'll talk about survey methods in a couple of weeks, so I'll leave a more detailed discussion until then. What you receive as a participant of a survey study is a packet of questions or prompts used to obtain information about you. That packet is called a questionnaire. On any given page of a questionnaire, you'll see something that looks like what you see on the right. The set of questions used to operationally define a single variable is called a measure. In this case, the variable that's being measured is relative advantages of spreadsheets in a workplace. You can see that this relative advantage variable is measured with 6 items. And the numerical system used to enumerate specific levels of agreement or disagreement is called the scale. Although different research textbooks might refer to or define these things in different ways, this is the way I want you to remember it for our discussion. We talked very briefly about scales, and I told you that the scale provides an important numerical system on which to evaluate the prompt or statement in each item. By far the most common way to scale an item in social scientific research is by using Likert type scales. Likert type scales provide participants with a statement to which participants are asked to respond with their level of agreement or disagreement to it. The number of points on the scale is usually odd, with 5, 7, or 9 being the most common numbering system. Why is it usually odd? Because odd numbers of points provide a midpoint that serves as a neutral response. Another type of scaling is called semantic differential scales. Semantic differential scales provide participants with a short prompt followed by a series of bipolar adjectives. So you might ask your participants to describe how their partner makes them feel. The adjectives can be comforted neglected, closeness distance, or hated loved. I want to draw your attention to something in measurement that can happen in both Likert type and semantic differential scaling. Notice in this example that for items 1 and 2, the left side reflects more favorable attitudes of one's partner, whereas the left side reflects negative attitudes for item 3. Item 3 is what we call a reverse-coded item, and it's inputted just so we can ensure participants are paying attention to the measurement items. For reverse-coded items, we do exactly that. We reverse code them. So when a participant answers 7 on this item, for example, we change that score to a 1 to make it consistent with the other items. The last scale worth mentioning is the Guttman scale. Honestly, very few Guttman scales exist because it's a little time consuming to put these together, but they have the comparative advantage of getting a good temperature check on where individuals stand with their attitudes towards an object or a person. The Guttman scale is a set of items that's organized in terms of intense feelings towards the topic. Because of the way it's organized, whenever a participant answers no to one of the items, it's assumed they would answer no to the remainder of the items. Here's an example of a Guttman scale. If you answered yes to the item, I would go to a meeting of a new college club, it means you already answered yes to the previous 2 items. However, if you answer no to the next item, I would join a new college club, it implies that you would answer no to the next 2 statements, so they don't even need to be asked. In this case, this participant's score on this scale would be a 3 because he or she got to the 3rd item and finished. That's pretty much all I have for Module 6, but please also remember to read the textbook pages listed in the syllabus. In today's video, we walked through measurement in quantitative research. We began by talking about the explication process and focused on 2 important components of it: conceptualization and operationalization. One important thing to remember about this section is that the conceptualization needs to be consistent with the operationalization. We then focused on differences in labeling among questionnaires, measures, and scales, although these terms are often used interchangeably. Finally, we talked about common forms of scaling in measurement. We looked at examples of Likert scales, semantic differential scales, and Guttman scales. As usual, please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions that come up or if you have any feedback about these videos. Apart from that, please don't forget about this week's module. Have a great remainder of your week and a productive but fun weekend. I'll see you next time.